In the summer of 1968, deep in the chaos of the Vietnam War, Private Thomas "Tommy" Blake, a 21-year-old Army infantryman from rural Kentucky, found himself stationed outside Da Nang. The heat was unbearable, the jungles unrelenting, and every sunrise came with the quiet dread of not knowing if he'd live to see the next one. But what haunted him more than enemy fire was the silence from back home. That changed the day he received a letter. Not from his parents, they'd long disappeared from his life, but from a stranger. Her name was Eleanor Reed, a librarian from Galveston, Texas, who had joined a volunteer program called Letters Across the Lines, meant to bring comfort and companionship to soldiers overseas. Her words were soft, precise, and carried the weight of someone who had never left her hometown but had read the world through books. He wrote back immediately, but not as Tommy Blake. Afraid of judgment, ashamed of the path that led him to the battlefield, a string of juvenile offenses, an absent father, a boyhood defined by foster homes and petty crimes, he signed the letter Sam Rivers, a name he'd made up on the spot. Sam Rivers was nobody, and that was what made him safe. The correspondence grew. One letter turned into 10, then 30, then 73. Eleanor wrote about poetry, about the smell of rain in Texas, about the hush of turning pages at dusk. Tommy, or Sam, responded with imagined memories, fields he never plowed, books he'd never read, dreams he barely allowed himself to have. And yet, in the act of pretending, something real began to grow. He started to fall in love with her words, with the way she saw the world. And he knew she was falling too. The guilt pressed harder with each envelope, but the fear of losing her by telling the truth was stronger than any conviction he'd ever faced. And so, he kept writing, and always signed, "Yours, Sam Rivers." If this story touched you the way it touched me writing it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing true stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next changes everything. By the time the monsoon season descended upon the thick jungles and scorched outposts near Da Nang, casting heavy, unrelenting rain over the corrugated tin roofs of the barracks and turning the soil beneath every soldier's boots into a slurry of mud and uncertainty, Private Thomas "Tommy" Blake had already developed the nightly ritual of unfolding, with great care and deliberate reverence, the delicate letter from Eleanor Reed that he kept folded tightly in the chest pocket of his uniform, not for luck, but for memory, not for morale, but for survival of the soul, that intangible eroding piece of him the war hadn't yet managed to obliterate. Each evening, once the humming of generators faded and the flickering lights dimmed in the makeshift triage tents, and once the jungle returned to its natural chorus of insects and unseen things rustling in the dark, Tommy would retreat into a corner, usually by the side of a supply crate or beneath the flickering halo of a rusted lamp, and read her letter as if it were scripture, as if her words, written in neat cursive on lined stationery that smelled faintly of lavender and paperbacks, were the only proof that somewhere, far from the chaos of mortars and bloodied bandages, a different world still existed, one where people read books in silence, where mornings began with toast and coffee, and where love wasn't something you held onto with shaking hands in the dark, but something you grew day by day in the warmth of being known. Eleanor's letters, though modest in their tone and rhythm, carried with them the gentle cadence of someone who believed in beauty despite knowing pain, someone who had never seen war, but who knew how to stitch the wounds it left through language and compassion. And though she only knew Sam Rivers, the name Tommy invented out of fear, shame, and the desperate desire to present himself as more than the broken son of an absent father and a forgotten childhood spent in and out of juvenile courtrooms. She spoke to him with a tenderness that went deeper than truth. And Tommy, in turn, wrote back, Not with facts, not with confessions, but with a version of himself he wished he could be. A man who had a home to return to, a man who grew up in fields of Kentucky wildflowers, who read Thoreau by lamplight, who had never stolen a car or slept in a police cell or signed enlistment papers just to escape the long silence of a name spoken with disappointment. As their letters multiplied, stretching into dozens, then into scores, each carrying with it more pieces of their imagined future. Shared mornings, a bookstore in some coastal town, children named after poets. Tommy began to understand that, while his hands were busy cleaning rifles and applying tourniquets, his heart had quietly been tying itself, thread by thread, to a woman he'd never seen, and who, if she ever learned the truth, might never want to see him at all. Still, the war didn't pause for longing. Every morning came with the sharp crack of orders, the deafening blades of helicopters, and the constant tallying of who didn't make it back. And in between all that, Tommy clung to Eleanor's words, not as comfort, but as resistance, a way of saying to the war, "You can have my body, but not my soul, because that's already been spoken for, and it lives in Galveston, Texas, behind a library desk and inside an envelope with a soft return address." There was one night, darker than the rest, after a failed operation in the Northern Hills, when his unit lost 2 men to sniper fire and another to a mine that left nothing but a helmet behind, that Tommy limped back to camp with dirt in his teeth and a scream lodged so deep in his throat it never found its way out, and in the stillness that followed, he sat alone on an overturned ammo crate and wrote Eleanor a letter so raw it made his fingers shake, telling her not what he'd seen, but what he feared he was becoming. He wrote, "Sometimes I think about walking into your library unannounced, just standing there until you realize who I am, but then I remember that you wouldn't, because Sam Rivers is just a name I invented, and I'm not brave enough to introduce myself as anyone else." At the bottom he hesitated. His pen hovered, his breath caught. For the first time since their correspondence began, he considered signing it Thomas. But the war had taught him that hope was dangerous, and honesty could be lethal, so he folded the page, kissed the corner the way she said she did before sealing hers, and wrote, once again, "Yours always, Sam Rivers." When the plane finally touched down at Travis Air Force Base in California in early 1970, and the hydraulic hiss of the landing gear gave way to a silence that felt heavier than gunfire, Thomas Blake stepped onto American soil with the gait of a man who had survived not just the war, but the long and corrosive loneliness that came from pretending to be someone else. And yet as he looked at the horizon where home was supposed to begin, all he felt was the echo of every letter he had written under a name that wasn't his. Every sentence wrapped in hope and falsehood, every Sam signed with trembling hands, and the fear that the truth would dissolve what little connection he had managed to build from thousands of miles away. His wounds were visible, a bandage across his right shoulder, the faint tremor in his fingers, the limp in his left leg from the explosion he never spoke of. But the deeper scars, the ones that couldn't be dressed or stitched, were the lies he carried like shrapnel, embedded too close to the heart to ever remove without causing permanent damage. He didn't go back to Kentucky, not to the trailers, not to the town where his name still lived in court records and school suspensions, but instead drifted to the edge of the country, settling in a modest boarding house outside Sacramento, where the land was flat, the people quiet, and no one knew the difference between Thomas Blake and Sam Rivers. He found work in an auto repair shop owned by an old Navy vet who never asked questions, only handed him tools and expected him to show up on time, which suited Tommy just fine, because the last thing he wanted was to explain how the man everyone called Doc in Vietnam was now just another nameless mechanic beneath a rusting Dodge, listening to the radio but never to his own conscience. Each night, after the garage closed and the streets grew still, he would unlock a weathered wooden box he kept under his bed. inside of which were all of Eleanor's letters, still tied with the green ribbon she had used, still smelling faintly of ink and time, still bearing the same quiet warmth that once pulled him back from the edge of war. And each time he touched them, he felt both comfort and shame, because she was still out there somewhere in Galveston, or maybe somewhere else, waiting for a man named Sam Rivers to come home, not knowing that Sam was just a borrowed name used by someone too afraid to offer her the truth. He tried to write to her again, many times, starting with "Dear Eleanor" and ending with "I'm sorry." But each time the words fell apart before they could reach the envelope, because how do you tell someone that everything they loved about you was a lie? Even if the feelings were real, even if the dreams were honest, even if the love you held for them was the only part of yourself that wasn't fabricated. So he didn't write. Instead, he read her last letter, the one she sent a few weeks after he returned, though she didn't know that. A letter where she wrote, "I don't know if you're alive or if your silence means the worst, but I still check the mailbox every day like some fool in a storybook who refuses to believe the ending." That sentence stayed with him for years, haunting him in his sleep, lingering in the oil-stained air of the workshop, whispering in the back of his mind every time the radio played a song from 1969. And still, he stayed silent. Until the day he picked up a local newspaper at the corner diner, not because he cared about the headlines, but because his hands needed something to do other than shake, and saw, on the bottom of page 7, a small feature titled, "Texas Librarian Kept the Letters of a Soldier She Never Met." The photo was grainy, but he knew her. Older now, her hair tinged with silver, but her eyes still searching, still bright, still Eleanor. The article said she had never married, said she still believed he might return, said she had kept every single letter, even the ones with coffee stains and creased edges. Tommy left the diner without finishing his coffee, got into his truck, and drove for hours. Not toward Texas, not yet, but just away from himself, because the weight of what he had done and hadn't done was suddenly louder than anything the war had ever thrown at him. That night, for the first time, he wrote her again. He wrote as Thomas. He told her who he really was, where he came from, what he had feared, and why he had stayed away. But he didn't send it, not yet. Instead, he placed it carefully in the same wooden box with all the letters she had written him, closed the lid slowly, and whispered, as if she could hear him through time, "I'm still here." By the time the leaves began to fall in the quiet Virginia town where Thomas Blake had quietly grown older, the edges of his life had softened into routine. Early mornings at the repair shop, evenings spent watching baseball reruns with a glass of cheap bourbon, and long nights spent writing letters he would never send, letters addressed to ghosts, to regrets, to the woman who once loved a name. He no longer dared to speak aloud, until one evening, at a local Veterans Hall gathering organized in honor of Vietnam-era servicemen, that rhythm was broken by the sound of a young woman's voice speaking from the stage, a voice that carried not just curiosity, but something deeper, something that pierced through the crowd and settled like a weight in Tommy's chest. She introduced herself as Anna Reed, a journalist working on a documentary about forgotten letters and unspoken stories from the war. And as she spoke about her mother, Eleanor, the librarian from Texas who had once exchanged letters with a soldier she never met, Tommy felt the air in the room shift, as though time had been holding its breath and was now finally exhaling. Anna said her mother had kept every single letter, over 70, in a cedar box that she opened once a year on the day she met Sam Rivers for the first time through ink and paper. She said Eleanor never stopped waiting, that even in her final days she believed he would appear, not with a bouquet of flowers or some grand apology, but simply with truth. Tommy sat frozen in the back of the room, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white, because there in front of him stood the daughter of the only woman who ever saw his heart, even if she never saw his face. And he realized that he was no longer hiding behind time, but sitting directly in the path of it. After the event, when the hall had emptied and the folding chairs echoed against the wooden floor, he approached Anna with the kind of hesitation that only a man carrying decades of guilt can understand. She turned to him, curious, polite. "You knew my mother?" she asked. He nodded slowly, feeling every year press against his spine. "I was the one she wrote to," he said. "My name isn't Sam Rivers. It never was." The silence that followed felt like a storm gathering at sea, distant but inevitable. She didn't move, didn't speak, just looked at him, really looked too. Not at the worn flannel shirt, the deep lines on his face, the trembling in his voice, but into his eyes, as if searching for the truth her mother had tried to find for decades in letters never answered. And then, in a voice far calmer than he expected, she asked, "Why?" He swallowed hard. "Because I didn't believe I deserved her. Because everything she loved about me was made up. Because I was afraid that if she knew the truth, she'd stop writing." Anna's eyes, her mother's eyes, filled with a sadness that wasn't anger, but understanding. The kind of sadness that only comes when a mystery is solved but leaves behind a story too human to condemn. They sat together on a bench outside the hall, beneath a sky filled with stars that neither of them noticed, and Tommy told her everything, not just the lie, but the life behind it, the mother who vanished, the juvenile detention cells, the name he stole to protect the fragile connection he had found with someone who saw beauty in him he hadn't known existed. He showed her the box. Inside were Eleanor's letters, carefully preserved, and one envelope different from the rest. Older, crinkled, sealed, but never sent. His last letter, the one where he told her everything. He handed it to Anna. She read it slowly, her eyes scanning every line, her breathing steady. When she reached the end, where he had finally signed his real name, Thomas Blake, she held the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. "She loved you," Anna whispered, even if she didn't know the whole story. She always said she knew there was something more behind the silence. "I failed her," he said. "No," Anna replied. "You were just late, but you're here now." The next day, they drove to Galveston together. At the cemetery, under a worn oak tree, Eleanor's headstone stood simple and unadorned, etched with her name, birth and death years, and a single line from a poem she used to copy in her journals. "Some letters are never finished, and some names never forgotten." Tommy knelt, placed the letter beneath the stone and read it aloud. He didn't cry the way he had expected. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply spoke as Thomas, and finally, after all the years, was heard. The return to Virginia felt different this time, not just in the miles traveled or the silence shared between him and Anna during that long stretch of highway, but in the way Thomas Blake now carried himself, no longer hunched beneath the invisible weight of a name that didn't belong to him, but upright, solemn, even proud, because for the first time in his life he had spoken the truth aloud. And in doing so, he had not lost everything as he had feared, but gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that he was still worthy of being remembered, not as Sam Rivers, the man Eleanor loved in letters, but as Thomas Blake, the man who loved her too deeply to ever believe he deserved her. In the weeks that followed, he returned to the quiet rhythm of his life, the repair shop, the early mornings, the back porch coffee. But nothing was quite the same anymore, because now the silence was different. No longer the silence of hiding, but the silence that comes after a truth is finally told, a silence that heals rather than haunts. He began speaking at local veterans groups, not to be applauded or pitied, but to share what he had learned, that sometimes the longest wars are not fought overseas, but inside ourselves, between who we are and who we pretend to be. And that there is a kind of courage not in facing bullets, but in writing your real name at the bottom of a letter when everything inside you says, don't. He brought Eleanor's letters to the library in Richmond, donating them to a special collection dedicated to wartime correspondence, with one condition: that they be displayed not as romantic relics, but as a testament to how words, even if born from fear or fiction, can still carry love, can still change lives, can still reach across decades and remind someone they were seen. And people came. Students, veterans, widows, strangers. They read the letters, tracing the ink with their fingers, some crying, some silent, all touched in ways Thomas would never fully understand. And that was enough. He received dozens of messages afterward, many from younger soldiers returning from newer wars, who told him that his story had given them the strength to speak honestly to the people they'd left behind, that they had written home not as who they wished they were, but as who they were becoming. One letter stood out. It read, "Dear Mr. Blake, I used to write my girlfriend from Afghanistan under a different name. I thought if she knew who I really was, she'd leave. After hearing your story, I told her everything. She stayed." Thomas folded that letter and placed it in the same wooden box where he had once hidden his shame, a box that no longer felt heavy, but full. He spent the last years of his life not chasing redemption, but offering reflection, quietly reminding anyone who asked that truth, even when told too late, can still matter, can still heal, and can still bring you home in ways geography never could. On the 3rd anniversary of Eleanor's death, he returned once more to Galveston, this time alone, carrying with him not a letter, but a small plaque. He placed it beside her headstone, pressed it gently into the soil, and stepped back. It read, "Thomas Blake, not who you thought I was, but always yours." And as the wind picked up from the sea and the air smelled faintly of salt and old paper, he whispered her name, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. And for the first time in decades, felt no need to write another letter, because the story had finally found its end, and this time it carried his real name. Years passed as they always do, not in sudden waves, but in quiet accumulation, a new wrinkle, a deeper breath, the way a name echoes less like a secret and more like a story when spoken aloud. And by the time Thomas Blake reached the final chapters of his life, there was no more pretending, no more hiding, and no more fear in being exactly who he had always been beneath the silence and the ink. He still kept Eleanor's final letter in a frame by his bedside, and every morning he would read the line she once wrote, "If Sam Rivers ever reads this, I hope he knows I truly existed," and he would smile, not because the line no longer hurt, but because he had finally become the man who could answer it, not as a ghost, not as a borrowed identity, but as Thomas Blake. Flawed, real, remembered. He didn't leave behind medals or children or a legacy of perfect choices, but what he did leave was perhaps more powerful. A story of honesty born too late, but not too late to matter. A love letter that became something larger than romance, a reminder that the truth, even when wrapped in mistakes, still has the power to reach someone, somewhere, and say, "You are not alone." The town remembered him as the quiet man who once told a room full of high school students that writing one honest letter might be the bravest thing they ever do. The librarians remembered him as the man who brought a box of old letters and asked for no spotlight, just a place where they could be held with care. And Anna Reed, daughter of Eleanor, remembered him as the man who showed up, late, yes, but fully, and gave her mother the ending she'd waited for in every unopened envelope. One spring afternoon, after Thomas had passed peacefully in his sleep, a small ceremony was held near the war memorial in town. There were no speeches, no trumpets, just a folded flag, a framed photograph of a younger man who never really existed, and a simple inscription placed at the base of the monument that read, "Thomas Blake." He signed his final letter with the truth, and in that truth was the full measure of his life. Not a perfect story, but a human one, not without regret, but rich in redemption. Not defined by the lie he told, but by the courage it took to finally tell the truth. We share new stories every day, true accounts that move, inspire, and stay with you. If this one spoke to you, leave a comment, share it with someone you care about, and come back tomorrow, because every heart deserves to be heard.